Let's get started on that next session. I'm Eric Kelderman, a senior reporter at the Chronicle of Higher Education. Really excited to be moderating what I think will be a terrific discussion with our guest today. You know, it seems like every day you scan the news, you can find some fresh attack on higher education. This past year, 22 states considered laws to dismantle diversity, equity, and inclusion programs at public colleges. 6 of those states actually passed such measures, according to our reporting. The Supreme Court ruled colleges can't consider race in admissions, undoing a half century of legal precedent in the United States. In Florida, we see a Republican governor and someone who's a major presidential candidate seeking to remake a public college in the image of a private, faith-based institution. All that is happening on top of a decade-long decline in enrollment, as well as the shrinking of state appropriations and the approach of the so-called demographic cliff that is projected to arrive in 2026. And yet, as Sarah mentioned, our recent poll suggests most of the public still finds some value in a college degree, if not everything that colleges are doing. Satisfying politicians might not ever be possible entirely, but can colleges assuage some of the public's concerns? Joining us today is Carrie Healy, former Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts and President of Babson College for 6 years, among many other experiences she's had. And Belle Whelan, the President of the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools, Commission on Colleges, one of the nation's major, what we used to call formerly regional creditors. Belle has also served as the Secretary of Education in Virginia and President of Northern Virginia Community College. Welcome to Carrie and Belle. You guys can turn on your cameras now. Are you with us? There's Belle. Carrie, are you gonna join us?
I am.
Okay.
Okay.
There we go. Great.
I think this works. Good.
Excellent. Well, it's really, I'm really excited to have you both here. You both have really extensive experience in both higher education and public service, in state government, and I think this is going to be great. I'd like to start with sort of a big picture question for each of you to address, and that is really a simple question, complex answers probably. How did we get to this point? What are the major, I guess, milestones or policy developments that you think have led us to the point where, you know, most people have serious reservations about higher education? Carrie, do you want to start with that?
Sure. You know, one of the things that was touched on in the introduction was this general notion that we've been losing faith in our institutions, in our public institutions generally. And a lot of this has to do with, honestly, the fading of the American dream. And when I look at higher education, I think that higher education and this promise of self-advancement through certainly college education has been one of the linchpins of the American dream and people's vision for that since World War II, since the GI Bill made it possible for so many people to enter higher education when they hadn't been able to in the past. And for several generations, that really made sense. And you knew that there was a promise associated with, you know, with that college degree, that you were going to be able to do better than your parents and that you were going to have a higher income. These days, that doesn't hold true. And I have to say that people are becoming cynical and becoming concerned about the promise of higher education because they're not seeing the same outcomes that they had expected to by making those really deep sacrifices in some cases, both their families or themselves, by going into debt in order to receive that education. And I'm sure we'll explore all the reasons why that is, all the diversity of different, you know, approaches to higher education that have better or worse outcomes for people. But I actually think that polling that you just did that showed that people are beginning to gain faith in other pathways towards personal prosperity and being able to support themselves. I think that's a good thing. and it will allow higher education to again refocus and think about what its role in society truly is, as opposed to this blind faith in higher education as being a stepping stone on the way to the American dream.
Sure. Belle, do you want to weigh in here for us?
Thanks, Eric. I appreciate it. In keeping with Ian's theme of dinosaurs, I'm the dinosaur here on this panel. I just began my 50th year in higher education and my 19th year in my current position. So I've seen a lot of change over time. What I think has happened right now is that the purpose of higher education for each individual has changed. When I first went to college back in the dark ages, we wanted to change the world and make it a better place, and all of this esoteric kind of stuff. Students today want jobs, and they want jobs now, and they want high-paying jobs. And higher education in its traditional format takes too long and costs too much money. And I think those three things, the change in the focus of why you go to college, the cost and the time, are major contributors to the loss of faith in higher education. It's just not happening for me. Plus, you can go Google whatever you want to know, and go to YouTube and find out how to do things. And so it's that immediacy of, I want to do it right now and get it done, that I think has impacted a lot of the perceptions of higher ed.
Interesting. We're going to come back to points from each of you on these issues, but I want to start with maybe I have a targeted question for each of you to answer. Carrie, most of the institutions we would refer to as sort of traditional colleges and universities profess in their mission statement to serve the public in some fashion, right? States and the federal government provide resources, maybe not enough always, but dollars in the form of financial aid or institutional support to both public and private colleges. In Massachusetts, for instance, as in several states with a robust private college market, there is a tuition grant that goes to students who enroll in private colleges there. I'd like to hear you talk about what you think higher education's responsibility is to the public. Is it different for public and private institutions? And where are institutions falling short on that?
Yeah. So I do think it's important to differentiate between private institutions that have as their goal or stated goal or part of their mission to benefit the public, and genuinely institutions that are public institutions that are established exclusively for that purpose. And I think that their levels of responsibility are slightly different. And in the last, I would say probably 20 years, maybe Belle can help me with this, those missions have been conflated and confused. That private institutions have been trying to behave more like public institutions, and public institutions have been trying to add on all the bells and whistles and accoutrements of private institutions in order to compete. And so there's been this confusion, and perhaps now is the moment when both public and private colleges are going to have to say, this is my role, this is my lane, and I'm going to stay in it.
Right. I want to follow up on that just a little bit, because as Lieutenant Governor, right? Colleges come to you at budget season, right? Both the public and the private. The Massachusetts colleges.
Not the private. Yeah.
Well, but there's a tuition assistance grant in Massachusetts, as well as New York and several other states, that goes to students who enroll in the private colleges in those states. So maybe the colleges aren't asking on behalf of themselves, but they're asking on behalf of students who might want to enroll. So they're getting that money indirectly. Certainly the federal investment in higher education is significant. I can't think of too many institutions that could forego those dollars at this point and survive. Are there options for those institutions? The money comes with strings attached, let's say, right? If you take the federal money or the state money, there are going to be expectations. So how do we break that bond, or don't we?
Well, I think that we have to understand what that money does. I think that money, that state money, allows students who would otherwise not be able to afford some private institutions or even public institutions to do so. And so you're increasing diversity, you're increasing access to higher education for people who need it and who want it. And so I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that is a positive use of public money to create a more educated electorate. It certainly was the original purpose of public higher education, as envisioned by John Adams and others. And actually, the Massachusetts Constitution was the first to actually enshrine public education in it as a support for democracy. So I think that all that is good. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that government is supporting students who wish to participate in higher education. Now, the bulk of the monies, though, from the federal government, at least, that go to private colleges, go for research grants. And I think that we could have an entirely separate discussion about whether the federal support for research in universities is actually a public good that we also must value and must look at separately and say, who would be conducting this research? How would society be if we didn't have this kind of very high level research being conducted in these private institutions? So I don't think that those monies flowing to the institutions are necessarily a negative thing. How would they do without it? I think they would have to change their model. And I think it would be a less inclusive model in terms of their student body. And I think that less would be discovered on a research level if they didn't have the federal monies.
Yeah, sure. Belle, in talking to college presidents, as I do, and I'm sure you do a lot, we often hear from them, that the public's discontent is just a messaging problem. If we could just, quote, if we could just tell our story better, then everyone would love us and things would be peachy, right? Is this really just a messaging problem, or are leaders burying their head in the sand here on some of these issues?
I don't think leaders are burying their heads in the sand. I think everybody's well aware of the perception and trying to figure out a way to turn it around. But I do believe that the leaders in our institutions often get caught up in trying to find that money for research, for hiring faculty, for keeping the lights on, for educating, I'll use that word, politicians about what it is that they do and stuff, and all of that, and lose sight of putting that message out about the value. They'll tout accomplishments they've made and rankings that they've had, but they don't always talk about Jane and Joe Citizen who have been able to make a better life for themselves because of the, having gone to college. You had asked a moment ago about the higher ed's responsibility to the public. I think there are two big buckets for that, if I might. One is to have an informed citizen, somebody who can go out and vote and understand what they're voting for, what they're voting, to stay healthy, and have a good lifestyle, to get involved in the community. All of that you kind of learn how to do and why you have to do it in college, ideally. And then the other is to help people become employable so that they can have a skill to make a better life for themselves, and they can pay taxes so that we can have the services that we have. So I think higher ed does both of those things. When we talk about numbers, though, we don't always talk about in terms of majors, in terms of impact that they've had. We don't talk about the relationships that institutions have with businesses and how the curriculum is done. I mean, the workings of it. We are so entrenched in that process that we forget that other people don't know it. I tell seasoned faculty all the time, you've been teaching a long time. You forget that last semester these students were asking for a bathroom pass in high school. And sure. they don't understand why they're here. They don't know how to go through the registration process. They don't know why they have to go through all the steps in the registration process. They don't know how to pick classes, let alone think about whatever the outcomes are, expected outcomes in those particular classes. And so sometimes we just get so into what we're doing, we forget other people don't understand it.
Right. And, I have a question later on about sort of the way colleges interact with their students and parents. And so, keep that in the back of your mind. I want to follow up with, a question for both of you. And this is a little bit provocative, but I want to ask, has higher education become a victim of its own success, right? When I graduated from high school, a much smaller percentage of my classmates went to high school went to college than current high school graduates, right? We're looking at numbers in the 70% range. If you're in Montgomery County, Maryland, where I live, it's more like 85%, right? And we hear, from places like the Georgetown Center on Education and the Workforce that 70% of jobs in the future require a bachelor's degree. So the message has gotten through to the public that you need a college degree, right, as the ticket to the middle class. With that increased expectation, though, shouldn't higher ed expect more scrutiny, right? More critiques about how they go about what they do and whether it's really affordable and accessible.
Well,
Either of you can
if I
start.
could,
Go
yeah,
ahead,
if I
Terry.
could jump in there a little bit, I think this is a language problem. One of the issues that higher ed has is that the term higher ed, brings in elite private institutions. It brings in, public institutions. It brings in community colleges, even online education, and some shorter training programs. And so what are we talking about when we're talking about higher education and the expectations for that? So we really need to break it down for people. And I agree with Belle that, we need to be able to communicate a little bit about what each piece of higher education should be able to accomplish, and then try to advance that conversation appropriately. So you're not going to get the same thing, from a short-term online course teaching you a technical skill as going to Harvard or Stanford. That's just not the case. So we can't have these sweeping discussions about what we expect from higher ed. But what I do like is the idea that there is a notion that it's getting more practical, and that maybe all of higher ed needs to get more practical, not just the community colleges, not just, colleges that are state colleges, but maybe even the elite colleges need to start saying, how are we going to get our students to graduate with real skills that are going to create return on investment that can be measured, so that instead of measuring how elite an institution is and have that be the measure of whether or not you aspire to that, maybe the measure should be, how much am I going to get out of this? How much of it is going to improve my life? Am I going to be able to pay my bills? Am I going to be able to function well as a citizen? That's really
Right.
what we want from higher education moving forward.
Right. Belle, do you want to weigh in here?
No, but I will.
Please do.
You asked if we were a victim of our own success. I mean, somewhat, I think there's a change in the expectation of higher education. We have historically, again, thought of people who are well prepared, take a college curriculum in high school, and can go and do the big jobs, the teachers, the doctors, the nurses, and higher education really is post-secondary education, anything after high school. So there is a place for everybody, whether it's a trade school where you go and learn how to do HVAC or plumbing or car maintenance or whatever. There are associate degrees where they're entry levels, into the job market, and we don't differentiate them for a lot of different reasons. I spent 28 years in community colleges, and we always felt like we were stepchildren to higher ed,
Sure.
even though, we fed the higher ed institutions, our graduates and our transfer students. So yeah, I think there is a perception that there is an elitism when you talk about higher education. I think that impacts who enrolls in higher ed. Students who don't perceive themselves able to compete in an elite institution perceive all of higher education as being elite, and therefore I can't apply because I can't function that way. And so, we're finding that we're trying to have to explain to students there is a college for everybody. We spent most of my 50 years trying to provide access to students, to let them know that there is a place for you. Now we're trying to help them understand, now that you're in, we need to get you out with some kind of credential so that you can have a better life and pay taxes and contribute to Social Security so I can retire soon.
Right. On the community college front, we didn't tackle this so much in our poll, but I've seen other polling from, say, New America. Community colleges, by and large, remain very popular with the public, right? They're seen as very practical, very affordable and accessible, and in fact, in most cases, they are. On the other hand, the enrollment decline that we've seen in recent years has hit almost, really disproportionately the community college enrollment. What we see, however, is students applying and enrolling in much higher numbers at more prestigious, more selective institutions. people are not gravitating toward the practical, affordable, accessible institutions. They think, I'm speculating here, maybe if I go to big flagship state U or this more prestigious private college, that my odds of succeeding in life will be higher. How do we change that? How do we get more people into programs that are, maybe more suitable for them, more affordable, more accessible, less expensive? What do we do with that?
I guess I'd like to push back a little bit on the premise. And what you say, I'm sure, is true in terms of the community colleges, but you're seeing great growth in terms of online programs and enrollment in college degrees that are wholly online, many of which are competency based. At Western Governors University alone, they have an enrollment of 250,000 students. It's burgeoning, and they're not alone. And so I think that what you may not see is that some of these students who had been enrolled in community colleges now see that there's a whole array of other options that may be even more affordable and more flexible in terms of accommodating their needs than a place-based college. So I think we need to maybe cast our view a little bit more widely in terms of the higher ed net to really see what's happening right now.
I think
Sure.
you also have senior and prestigious institutions that are having a much more robust enrollment plan because the student enrollment is declining. The number of traditional college age students has declined. And so they're going after the same pool of people, and they're getting much more aggressive in recruiting students that they never would have recruited before. I think research is also showing us that community college students do as well as or better than native students in a senior institution. And I think the senior institutions are finally hearing that and recognizing that they get a good quality student if they go to the community colleges or try to recruit those same students, into their own institutions.
Interesting. One group that in our polling, and I'll allude to some findings that we haven't published yet, but one group that is very dissatisfied in our poll are people who have some college and no degree, and as well as people who are still carrying the burden of student loans. This speaks to maybe an accountability issue, right? Which is in the past, when you could get a job without a college degree, if you dropped out, you could still go earn a middle class wage, right, and take care of yourself and your family. That's becoming much harder. So I want to raise the question: what do we do about accountability? Right, it's no longer acceptable for institutions to not graduate the bulk of their students, right? Especially if they're going to graduate with some student debt, and we know that those folks have the most difficulty paying back that debt. Is that part of the problem here, that colleges aren't living up to an accountability issue?
Well, I would say this is one of the most serious problems, that we're confronting right now. The individuals who have debt and don't have a degree are in the most difficult situation. They are struggling to work their way out of this. And I hope that if there is a loan forgiveness program at some point, that it does focus on the plight of these students. We need to start thinking about how education can be delivered in stackable chunks, so that if you are in that group that is unlikely to be able to actually complete an entire degree, is there a certificate? Is there something else that you can take away with you that's going to help you be more employable and give you some value from that? And also, colleges and universities do genuinely need to focus more on retention and taking care of their students' needs and understanding their students as whole people who have much more complex needs than simply getting through the courses in many cases. So I think that it does point us to a serious problem that needs to be addressed.
I think there's several reasons for an accountability problem, and some of that is preparation that the students bring with them to enter college in the first place. All high school curricula are not equal. And students who are coming to college today are not necessarily college ready when they come to college. And so it takes them longer to finish. They get discouraged because it is taking so long. We're back to, I need it fast, I need it cheap, and it's taking too long. And so they don't stay. number one. Number two, our job market has changed tremendously. An auto mechanic, 50 years ago is not the same as an automotive technician today. There are higher order learning skills that students need for today's job market. And a lot of those jobs you cannot get anymore without a college education or some college out there. Everybody doesn't go to college with the intention of graduating, though. And to assume that a college itself is not being successful because its students drop out does not necessarily mean it's not being successful. Depends on why the student went in the first place. That's one of the arguments that community colleges have forever. Most students don't go to community colleges with the intention of graduating with an associate's degree and transferring to a senior institution. They go because they want to take one or two classes that's going to help them get a promotion or get an entry, into a job market. And so how we assess that accountability, it could be impactful as well on the perception of how people feel about colleges and higher ed.
Right. Historically, people that have been, if we take as a premise that a bachelor's degree, that college isn't for everyone, is a sort of truism, right? We know that the folks that have been shut out of that process in the past have been Black and brown people from low-income backgrounds, people who have less academic preparation and come with less financial resources to college. The demographics of the country are shifting. We're going to be a majority minority country by the early 2040s, which isn't that far off, to be honest. And those are the folks that arguably we need to get into the college pipeline, right, to preserve the fundamental middle class, right, in terms of earning power. The Supreme Court, on the other hand, has just ruled that the colleges can no longer use admissions, race and admissions for considering students. What should be college's response at this point?
I think that there are other means that institutions can use to attract minority students. And I think we've got plenty of examples of programs out there, and even the Supreme Court decision, said that there are other things that you can use. The Department of Ed and Department of Justice just came out with guidelines on other things that can be considered. So I don't know that is that should be an excuse that institutions use. That they can't do that. There's still plenty of ways that they can do that, but there has to be intentionality built into it. You've got to want to do it. You have to have an appreciation for the value in doing so and having a diverse student body, not just ethnically diverse, but intellectually diverse and faith-based diverse and all other kind of diversities that are out there, physically disabled diversity. I mean, all of it, because as people move into real world and as they are forced into adulthood, they're going to have to deal with people of all kinds of ilks. And so for higher education to only look at race as a form of diversity, I think is unfortunate and will have a negative impact on the students that they do recruit, because they just won't have a full experience.
Right.
I agree with Bill. I think that colleges now for almost 40 or more years have been expanding that notion of what diversity means and understanding how much value it brings to the student body experience, to have a genuinely diverse class. And they're not going to give that up, just because it's been made a little bit more difficult by this Supreme Court ruling. I think that already the colleges that I'm in contact with are, figuring out, triangulating how they can do their admissions process, in such a way that they're looking for diverse candidates in other ways, and making sure that they can still be identified and brought into the experience. So I'm cautiously optimistic that higher ed institutions will find their way around this blockade that's been put up.
Right. When we think about it, I want to come back to this idea that the way colleges sort of interact with students, and there are a number of policy solutions, I think, that a lot of folks have posited as ways to smooth the process, right? We've simplified the FAFSA form, right? Or are in process of simplifying the FAFSA form. We've extended Pell to year-round, right? Summer Pell now. So there's students can attend year-round using their Pell Grant, things like that. There are a number of other sort of sticky issues, though, that I think folks feel like higher ed is not dealing with adequately, and make it maybe difficult for students to get into college. You know, one thing that comes to mind is, you know, the ease and availability of transfer credits. Even in public colleges across in some states, you can take a college in one class at a public two-year college. That class is not guaranteed to transfer if you progress on to get a bachelor's degree, right? There are some states that have tackled this. I can think of Minnesota, for instance. I believe California as well. That's one issue. Financial aid award letters, right? The GAO came out with a report, I want to say a year or so ago, right? That really blasted higher education for not providing adequate and transparent information on financial aid award letters. Those seem to me like no-brainers, right? Like things that colleges and higher education should be able to accomplish that would go a long ways toward making college seem accessible to a broader population. And I'd like to hear, Belle, why don't you start with that?
Yeah,
you're welcome.
You
can thank me later.
The transfer of credit issue is a big issue. And we have struggled with that. When I was Secretary of Ed in Virginia, one of the things that then Governor Warner wanted was articulation agreements between the senior institutions and the community colleges to make transfer a lot easier. Florida has changed all of their course numbering systems so that whether you're going to what used to be called a community college, is now a state college, or one of their universities, it's the same class, same description, same numbers. And so we've seen a great advancement in transfer of credit, believe it or not, at least within pockets of regions. You know, either within a state, you've got these articulation agreements. HBCUs have signed a lot of articulation agreements in recent years with community colleges. You know, but we don't have a national policy on transfer of credits because it's faculty at institutions that determine transfer policies. And until we find a way to help all faculty understand, you know, that English 101, and I'm not picking on English, I'm a psych major, Psych 101 should be the same at all institutions. Until we can get somebody to believe that, we're going to struggle with this one. It's becoming imperative, though, especially on our military families who have to move around a lot and who end up repeating classes because they can't get their classes transferred. So I think one thing that has been going on is that senior institutions are sitting down with at least their community colleges within their states to say, okay, if your students transfer, this is what we will accept for this course, so that students aren't taking courses at the community college that won't transfer to a senior institution. Now, senior institution to senior institution, that's a horse of another color.
Harry, do you have any thoughts on some of these issues?
Well, your Belle's comments just vividly brought back to mind the transcripts that I saw from my mother-in-law, who was a Marine wife and had done little bits of college, you know, all across the country over many years. She ended up being a high school principal, but what effort went into that. So I would just voice support for trying to make this more regularized across the country. And also say this is also a reason why some people go to competency-based colleges, right? So that they don't have to worry about, you know, whether this transfers, whether that transfers. They're able to, you know, prove that they have the skills and move forward and have the credit.
Right.
It's also helping to understand why the online enrollment has increased tremendously, because no matter where you are, you can take the course with you.
Right. You know, another issue I think that came up in the chat here is as the number of high school students declines, there's still a large population of people with some college, no degree. It's been, I think, challenging perhaps for colleges to pivot in ways, traditional higher education, to pivot towards serving that population more broadly. We've seen, you know, Southern New Hampshire, certainly, and Western governors and others really emphasize those populations. How hard is it, do you think, Belle, for what we say is traditional higher education to make that move and to begin to serve, think about students, a broader population of students, not just 18 to 22-year-olds or 18 to 20.
I don't think it's difficult at all. As a matter of fact, a lot of them are doing it. I was on Lumina's board for a while, and about 4 years ago, they started tracking students who had some credit and hadn't graduated, and colleges immediately identified that population and went back and said, why didn't you graduate? For some of them, it was because they owed a library fine. Or a parking ticket or something, ridiculously ludicrous like that. They hadn't paid their graduation fee. For some, it was because life got in the way and they had to stop at the last moment and hadn't found a way to go back. It's difficult for an adult who is working and has a family, who went to an undergraduate school 300 miles away from home, to suddenly want to get their degree from that institution. Yeah. And I think COVID helped tremendously too with moving everybody to online instruction. So now those adults can go back and finish that degree because they can enroll in an online course at the institution at which they began, 20 years ago. So I think it's gotten a lot better, but that's one of those messaging things that you don't hear about as much, that I think institutions could use out there, to show that we really are trying to reach people and make a better life for all of them.
Right. And as that demographic cliff approaches, colleges are going to get very interested in students of all ages and trying to figure out how to fill those seats. And I would say some of the low-hanging fruit will be people who started but haven't finished yet.
Right. We did see during the pandemic, certainly during the height of the pandemic, we did see higher education pivot rather quickly, although maybe not always effectively, towards all online courses. Do you hope that when the cliff hits, so to speak, will higher education be able to make that same pivot more quickly towards a broader population, I wonder?
I think it's already happening, Eric.
Okay.
I don't, I don't think they're waiting for it. They don't have a choice. If they want to stay open, that they're going to have to go recruit a very different population. We see more international students being recruited by institutions that traditionally did not go, after that market, as it were. So, I think everybody's starting that already. You can see the average age of students is creeping up at all of our colleges because they're going back to recruit those adults, either who began and hadn't finished or just want to get started now.
Right.
I would agree with that assessment. There's an endless pool of qualified and knowledge hungry students around the world who would love to come to American colleges and universities if they had the opportunity. And so one of the big questions is, how are we going to make financial aid available to them, loans available to them? Often this is one of the few things that keeps international students from coming to the US. And so at Babson, we had, almost 30% international students. That was our tradition. It was a business school and it looked at global business, but they brought great, richness and really added to the conversations in the classroom. So I hope that our universities here in the U.S. begin, looking to ways to bring more international students to us. And I hope that our politicians are smart enough to keep them once they graduate.
Right. Right. I want to go back to, this idea that the slides we brought up before the discussion started showed that a lot of folks consider some of these alternatives, trade schools, apprenticeships, as being just as good, right, as a degree in higher education. I'd like to know, what does that mean long-term for higher education? Have we reached peak higher education? And if other alternatives begin to become as popular or more popular than colleges, is that a good thing overall? How do institutions respond? I know Carrie started with this idea that it's a good thing. Why don't you pick up on that?
Well, I mean, I genuinely do believe this is a good thing, because I think that what it tells us is that people are beginning to look for return on investment in their education. And so if traditional colleges and universities want to compete with trade schools and alternatives for those students to bring them back, they're going to have to incorporate some piece of practical knowledge into what they're teaching. And I don't care if it's a Harvard or whether it's a state school, a University of Massachusetts, that student is going to have to feel that they can go out into the world and bring something from their education that's going to help them succeed. And so I think it's pretty easy. I think teaching entrepreneurship in all colleges and universities at all levels. It would be a very easy way to make sure that everybody walks away with some piece of knowledge that can benefit them in the future, even if it's just a way of thinking entrepreneurially and acting entrepreneurially in their own life. It doesn't have to be starting a business, but that's something that everyone can know. Everyone should have some technical skills. Everyone should be able to, have some piece that they can bring to their employer that says, I have this technical skill or I can acquire them. So I don't think it's a lot. I don't think it's a big curriculum shift that has to happen at liberal arts colleges, but I think it has to happen.
Right. Bill, if there's less college overall or less college going overall, is that a good thing for higher education?
Perhaps. I think the reality is we're going to see, we had an explosion of colleges open up in the 60s and 70s when the community college movement began. I mean, just, everywhere somebody walked, there was a college that was opened. Did we have too many? Probably. When you look at the shift in the population, the fact that generations today are not having as many children as they used to, so we don't have as many people going to college. Do we have more colleges than we need? Probably. The other piece that's impacting that is the financing of higher education. We're seeing many more colleges either merge or close because they can't afford to stay open. And it's not just private colleges that are experiencing that. It's, small public colleges that are also experiencing that. And so I think we're going to right size for whatever reason, as time moves forward. And I think the fact that there are options for students, you used to go to college, like I said, for those traditional job markets. And now, because the job market itself has changed, there are other places that you can go to learn the skills that you need to go into the job market. Technology is a perfect example of that. With all of the IT jobs that are out there, you don't necessarily need even an associate's degree to get a job in an IT field. And many companies are starting their own training programs because they're more interested in getting somebody. There's a greater need. I won't say they're more interested, but there's a greater need to get somebody to actually be in there and make the widgets and than it is to team build and all the other kinds of things that we teach in higher education. And so the competition is there because the job market is driving it. And you've got students who want a job. I started by saying that. That's why they go to college. They want a job. And so the faster I can get a job, the better. And if I can get a job by getting micro-credentials at my state college, wonderful. If I can do it by going to McDonald U, great. I need a job and I want to go find it quick, fast, and in a hurry.
Right.
And
well, yes. Well, unfortunately, we are actually out of time for today. I could spend all day talking to both of you, and I really appreciate your participation in this panel. I'm going to sign off for now. Eric Kelderman, senior reporter at the Chronicle of Higher Education, and I hope all of you in the audience stay tuned for our next session coming up in just a minute or two. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.